It is Friday, October 7th. Let's talk PlayStation. It has been a very busy week. There's a lot to go over, so hopefully this episode isn't too long. Bear with me, but let's start, as always, with our PS Plus reminder. The October PS Plus Essential Games are still live, so go grab those, check them out. And for our first story, let's talk about the very exciting new PS5 firmware, which is 22.02, 06.00.01. It's your standard, very small firmware. It slightly improves the overall system performance. The more exciting PS5 firmware news is that it turns out PS5 has finally been jailbroken, partially. That's the big caveat here, so depending on where you initially saw this news, you might have the wrong impression of what's actually happened here, but PS5 has been partially jailbroken. So in the hacking scene, the Flow was working on this a while ago, if you remember back in like January or something, and Spectre Dev pretty much came in and finished the work on this initial kernel exploit and released it a few days ago. Initially it was only for firmware 4.03, but now it's working up to 4.50, which at this point is an older firmware, so the vast majority of consumers are likely past this. And it's something where when attempting this, it's very unstable. So apparently it only works like 30% of the time. The vulnerability here is indeed centered around WebKit. And the reason why it's a partial jailbreak is that there's only read-write privileges. You do get the debug menu, but that's basically it. You can't run unsigned code, but in the context of jailbreaking, you're gaining some kind of privileges or access that standard retail units weren't meant to have, so this is a very small entry point in fully hacking PlayStation 5. One of the cool things we've seen thus far, though, is the attempt of reinstalling things like PT, which the problem there is that there's multiple blacklists on PS5, so if you remember when the console initially launched, PT could be installed and played, but Sony had to blacklist the game from being bootable since there was a small window of opportunity where the transfer process from PS4 allowed that game to be installed on PS5. So there's a blacklist preventing you from installing a game and also a blacklist for booting it. Michael Kemp on Twitter was able to edit the whitelist with this new jailbreak, so he was able to install and boot Robinson the Journey, which is one of the 6 retail PS4 games that are considered not playable through backwards compatibility. Michael doesn't have PT on his account, but in theory this would allow you to play PT or the PS4 games that aren't compatible via backwards compatibility. Also PS4 demos, those are all considered blacklisted. So in theory, you're not allowed to play those, but at least with this jailbreak, that's what's in theory possible, and it's an entry point. So it's a partial jailbreak, but over time we can see maybe something new spring up. But it is a very old firmware, so the vast majority of people are not going to be able to, attempt this, right? Especially when, it's something where even if you keep your PS5 offline, the reason why Sony's generally okay with allowing this stuff to be disclosed, because in the context of this, they were, it's the bug bounty program. You can find exploits, report them to Sony, they'll patch them. This has already been well patched, a while ago, right? Because we're on firmware 6.0 now, but, then at that point, this is allowed to be disclosed because most consumers are not going to be able to mess around with this, especially if you keep your PS5 offline. Even when you buy new PS5 discs, that alone will often have newer firmwares required on disk, so when you insert them in your PS5, you're not going to be able to stay on, 4.0, 4.50. It'll make you update just offline to play that particular game. So it's pretty noteworthy. It's something where we don't actually follow the, jailbreak or hacking scene, the PlayStation scene, all that closely. But this is still a pretty big breakthrough for PS5 in general. If you want more of a thorough walkthrough and, a deep dive on this topic, the B-roll I've been showing, of course, is Modern Vintage Gamer. So I implore you to check out his video on this particular topic. Anyway, moving on to our next news story, PlayStation Stars has officially launched in North and South America, and this is something where, now that more people have it, there's a lot more analyzing on how it actually works, and what we've found out more or less with the point accumulation is that, at least here in the US, it's roughly 10 points per dollar spent. The campaigns are simply for collectibles or bonus points, so you'll always get points for buying games on PSN. It's just a matter of if you unlock a campaign and choose to buy a game through a campaign, you get the points for buying it, and then you get an extra 50 or so, whatever that campaign is. But overall, obviously the conversion rate isn't great if you compare it to other reward systems, but hey, it's some kind of cashback program. It's better than nothing. My advice here is that, obviously sign up, right? It can't hurt. And also, if you can, combine it with a credit card that also has good rewards. Nowadays there's so many ways to get a little something back out of your spending. So it's nice to see PSN finally has something. And since the points, they expire after 24 months, if you're not a heavy spender on PSN, I say redeem the $5 PS Store credit the second you qualify for it, because just based on the 2-year timeline, how much it spends, how much you have to spend to get $5 back, which is like $125 something. Just keep that in mind. But yeah, my big thing is I would like them to offer a code for physical games. That's a big bummer that for the time being you're left out if you prefer to buy discs at retail. As for the collectibles, a lot of people have been asking, how do you get the PS3 one? I'm fairly certain you need to have had your PSN account either made or signed into a PS3 at some point to get that collectible to show up in your app, right? So you still have to launch a PS4 or a PS5 game to complete the campaign, but I'm not entirely sure how it shows up, but I would figure it's something in relation to your account's history with PlayStation 3 in some way. It's got to be when you made your account, right? And I'm not sure if changing your PSN ID nullifies you out of it or something. Right now, it seems like it's been fairly slow on the app actually updating on based on if you complete certain tasks. And for the Hit Play 1994 campaign, here's the solution published by Push Square. You need to launch all these games in order to get the collectible. And sometimes it can take hours for the app to update, so launch the games while you're signed into PSN, and you should get the credit at some point. And if you're a PS Plus member for extra or premium, you can also stream the title, and that should count towards unlocking the collectibles. But otherwise, it looks, it's a no-frills rewards program. Again, I think the collectibles are kind of cool, but I'm not going to get too crazy into them. But it's better to get something back for your money than nothing at all. But hopefully they'll improve it and offer codes for physical games. Now, one other thing that we can mention about PlayStation Stars is that there is some kind of secret level 5, because if you remember, there's only 4 levels of, like the part of the loyalty program, but there's a secret level 5 that Sony may or may not use. It might be based on an invite-only system, depending on your how much money you spend or how committed you are or whatever, but basically there's collectibles and images that were found on the PlayStation site's code, so we know that it's there. There's even like a little text box that explains your reward for reaching level 5. So they might not even use this, but we do know that there is at least some kind of intention of offering level 5, which may include an extra perk or, well, the collectible that I'm showing you. Now, of course, one of the bigger stories from this past week was a rumor about a possible PS5 remaster of Horizon Zero Dawn, and a leaked document that came out showcasing that remaster and a bunch of other projects across SIE, both internal and external partners. And it wasn't complete, obviously. That's not the entire list of what Sony has going on, but it's something where, in the interest of not having too many stories today, we talked about that in a Tuesday video, so you can watch that to get caught up on everything. But one thing we mentioned in that video and kind of glossed over is that it does appear that we have indirect confirmation of Horizon Forbidden West DLC. The actor Lance Reddick, who plays as Silence in the game, he recently sent out this tweet by accident, on purpose, but he wasn't supposed to, which he says, "Hard at work in a session for Horizon Forbidden West," before it was screen capped on Reset Era, and he deleted it shortly after. He's even got the hashtag Horizon Forbidden West, so it's not mocap for Zero Dawn again or something like that. It seems pretty clear that we're probably going to get Forbidden West DLC. In fact, there's a certain area in the game. It's, where is it? It's like south on the map, but it's kind of an area where it clearly looks like that's where it's going to open up and, let you play around in a whole new area. Kind of like the Frozen Wilds with Zero Dawn. So I would expect that that's probably due sometime next year, and that's also when we could see a new repackaged, Forbidden West where it's a complete edition. And that's also where we're not sure where the Zero Dawn remaster is going to go, because I still expect it to be either, a standard $50 release at retail, $10 upgrade for current owners, or they might repackage it with Forbidden West or maybe the multiplayer project that we're hearing about. But it seems like we are getting DLC. Next up, nothing too crazy here, but God of War Ragnarok has officially been rated by the ESRB. It's rated M. Shocker. But this is still a pretty big milestone, so the game is still on track to come out November 9th very exciting. The ESRB says you're going to be doing some very violent, gory things in this game, like fighting trolls, centaurs, dragons, and also the words and are heard in the game. Good old ESRB and good old Santa Monica Studio. Going to be a great game. Can't wait. And in more God of War news, we actually have a report from InsiderGaming.com breaking down how long the game is expected to be, which it seems fairly comparable but slightly longer than the 2018 game. So the report says the entire experience is around 40 hours. 3.5 of those 20 hours played are cutscenes. So basically the remaining 16 or so hours is the gold path of gameplay. So if you're going straight for the main quest line, the main story, should be about 16 hours. And then there's 20 more hours of side quests. So again, very comparable to the 2018 game, just a bit longer with more side quests added into this one with an additional hour of cutscenes in those extra side quests. Seems good to me. I don't really want the game to overstay its welcome, at least not in the same way that sometimes it feels like that depending on the genre, right? So like with The Last of Us Part 2 or even Uncharted 4, right? Like those games are really fun the first time through, but they're not as replayable to me because they're just so long for that kind of genre. Some just work better for a 50, 60, 70-hour experience, although I do understand the point of there's a lot to wrap up in this game when it comes to the story and the realms and what you're trying to see, because when that 2018 game came out, I think the sentiment largely was there's going to be 2 more games, and then it was surprising to find out, no, the next one is it. Ragnarok is going to happen. So, and there's not much extra time on this one versus the 2018 game, but I have faith they've got a tight experience that has a lot of engaging content the whole way through. I would much prefer that over 60 or 70 hours for this kind of game where I might not feel compelled to spend that much time with it. Moving on to PlayStation's PC offerings, it was very recently that Sony put up a new product page on their main site for PlayStation games on PC, and we talked about how there was an FAQ on that site that answered a lot of questions about possible PSN connectivity or trophies or cross-play and cross-buy functionality, things like that. And a lot of it was no, but they kind of implied that it's coming. And also we saw there were config files in Spider-Man PC where some of the stuff was coming, and it turns out that did not take very long for it to be a reality because Spider-Man PC was recently updated, and on the changelog we can see they fixed a number of bugs. They updated AMD FSR to 2.1.1. They changed the VRAM budget to allow for more video memory usage, and also PSN connectivity is live. It's very crude. You can't really do much. You can sign into PSN and get some bonuses, so you get like a skill point and a new suit. But that's it really, so nothing crazy, but we at least see that they are initially offering this in one game, and I suspect it will come to either more of that back catalog or there's going to be tighter integration coming out moving forward with more PC releases. So hopefully Sony will do something very cool where maybe someday they'll eventually offer cross-buy. I don't expect that anytime soon, but trophy support would certainly be very cool, so you could earn trophies on a PC version of a game. And then eventually Sony might offer a launcher and things like that. But they're getting there, just slow progress. Next up, Hideo Kojima is doing more teasing for his next game. We just don't know if it's for Death Stranding 2 or if it's for that Xbox Cloud project. But it's still that, who am I? Now it's where am I, which it still features that silhouette. But very recently during PAX Australia, there's a QR code somewhere. I guess Lance McDonald finally found it or something. He put it on Twitter like a few hours ago, and if you scan it, it takes you to Kojima's site, and it does reveal that the silhouette was Elle Fanning. So it still doesn't tell us what the game is. It's Kojima. It's going to be the very subtle, slow rollout of teases, which may eventually lead to something that confirms what this game actually is, but we'll keep our eyes on it and see if anything big comes out of this. Moving on to some PSVR 2 news. This one is certainly a rumor, but one where I hope it's true because the leak.co, which I have no idea how reliable or credible this website is, that seems to be the consensus around all the websites reporting this, but the leak.co recently published a report that Half-Life Alyx is coming to PSVR 2. Sony was allegedly in negotiations for this game for a while up until they eventually settled on a deal somewhat recently, and now Sony's planning to publish the game on PSVR 2 sometime next year. It won't be a launch title, but one where, I would be shocked if Sony was not having those conversations to begin with. It's in the VR space, it's like, everything's kind of off the table. You have to talk to who you have to talk to, and, just get the software, right? This is a pinnacle VR experience, and it's beneficial to Sony. It's beneficial to Valve to, get the game out there to more people. It moves the VR space forward. So, hopefully it's true, because it really is a fantastic VR game that would do wonders on PSVR 2 for such a high-grade headset that the game truly demands for the full experience. Now, another PSVR 2 news, Bloomberg is reporting with a source that's familiar with this particular matter that Sony plans to manufacture 2 million PSVR 2 units by March of next year, which we already know Sony plans to release this thing early next year, so that means they're planning to have nearly 2 million by at least by launch, around launch, shortly after launch, but that is a huge number. For comparison's sake, PSVR, the first headset, it took Sony 8 months to sell 1 million units. Now, of course, context and timing is everything here, so 2016, VR was in its very early infancy. It was PSVR and one or two other, premium headsets on the market. And it was, of course, a very steep entry price for what was a brand new emerging niche market. And VR is still pretty much that. It is niche, but there's way more interest in it nowadays versus 2016. So 2 million is a good jump. It seems like Sony is certainly bullish. And that also implies that it should be fairly easy to buy one on launch or around launch if you're looking to get into one of these things. That alongside PS5 stock, which, this week again was a huge win. I saw PS5 base model consoles on PS Direct sitting there in stock, ready to go for hours, over a day at a time. And that's awesome. So between that and the news of, potentially 30 million PS5s being manufactured for fiscal year 2023, which I think some are really overlooking just how big that number actually is. 30 million is a lot. So I think next year, that's it. Like, it's going to be pretty good with availability overall. So, and we're getting close. But yeah, Sony's been bullish on VR, and I'm excited for PSVR 2. And hopefully it is something where if you do want to try it, if you're interested, it's not going to be the nightmare that we had with PS5 initially. Next up, we have a lot of interviews and quotes from the PlayStation Studios head Hermen Hulst. For whatever reason, last week was the press junket because he did 4 separate places where a lot was said. So we have a ton to go over because we're going to cherry pick a lot of the more interesting things that he talked about. But across 4 different places, again, a lot was said. So speaking with rooters, Hermen Hulst talked about their expansion into PC, mobile, and live services. But on the topic of their minority investment into From Software, Hulst said, and I quote here, "You should think of collaborations on the game development side first and foremost, but it's also not unthinkable with our PlayStation Productions efforts that we explore opportunities." So that first part there, of course, is a big one where first and foremost, game opportunities. And we know they have a long history, actually. Demon's Souls, Bloodborne, also Diracine on PSVR, which some seem to forget that was a project as well. And it's funny because, initially Sony's Shuhei Yoshida did not like Demon's Souls. But, after something like Elden Ring, I think Sony is acutely aware of the importance of the talent at that studio. That's why that investment was made to begin with, and now that they can, now they have the publishing power and the money to, retain the IP, because something like Elden Ring, they can't, Bandai Namco owns that, and that goes into the second part of this quote where PlayStation Productions. So yeah, Sony seems to want to be the ones to handle some kind of From Software property and adapting it into TV, film. Who knows if we're going to get some kind of Bloodborne Netflix series. It seems like anything is really on the table at this point when it comes to PlayStation Productions, but Sony is certainly they want to be the runner-up and having the opportunity to adapt those properties when From Software has something that they can retain themselves, or of course Sony owns a lot of these as well. But again, after the success of Elden Ring, we should certainly watch the relationship very closely because there is a history there, right? And so it would not be unheard of or even shocking to see that Sony secures, say, another exclusive project with From Software that at this point, after how widely successful Elden Ring was, is, I think, at that point going to really upset people. But it would be in Sony's best interest to certainly, get very close to what is such a valuable studio. Now, speaking with Stephen Totilo of Axios, the PS Studios head Hermen Hulst also touched on a number of topics, namely their diversification and how it's very much just that, diversification. So Hermen says, and I quote here, "We have a history and a reputation for building these incredible narrative-driven single-player games, such as The Last of Us and Horizon and the upcoming God of War Ragnarok." Hermen goes on to say their developers love making these kind of experiences, and they'll continue to do so. "Some of our biggest titles in the single-player narrative-driven space are also our most profitable titles." Now, on the topic of PS4 support, he says, and I quote, "We certainly don't want to forget the millions of active players on PS4, and we want to ensure there are great games for them as well. We're evaluating it on a case-by-case basis." Hulst also talked about the scrutiny surrounding crunch and how it affects the livelihood of those making these blockbuster games. He's taking a more nuanced approach here where, for example, if an art director wants to work on a Saturday, Hermen says, and I quote here, "Am I going to say no? Well, it's a bit more complex, because what if his entire team then feels obliged to also go in? So what that means is that we need to have a conversation with the art director and say, that's about the game, but there's also your team." That's actually a pretty good answer when it comes to crunch, or at least one where it's not an answer, but it's explaining the root problem of crunch, which it is a problem, but it's not as black and white as healthy 40-hour work weeks or, crazy 80-hour work weeks where everybody's forced to do it, and that does happen, and that's unfortunate, but there is this big gray area for what is a creative field. Some developers do willingly want to invest more time because they're creatively and emotionally invested into their project, but it creates that culture and social dynamic where some don't want to feel left out, they don't want to feel like they're not contributing. Sometimes developers want to do it because they want to look like a good candidate for a career advancement, so there's a lot more nuanced areas of the topic of crunch, and I appreciate the candidness of Hermen's answer on that particular question. But also with the PS4 stuff, that's certainly been a hot topic lately. We did a video on that like 3 weeks ago when it comes to cross-gen games. I assume he's referring to, because again, he says a case-by-case basis, but it's got to be something where it's either the live service games or also a project that just doesn't necessarily demand, PlayStation 5 overhead, right? If we're talking about a later life cycle game, if it's something where it's a bit more modest in scope, then sure, in theory, it could ship on PS4. Again, the big reason why we're seeing more PS4 games than usual is the very similar architecture. It's far more financially viable nowadays to ship a previous generation version versus other console life cycles where there was always a pretty big shift in what was generally seen as exotic architecture after exotic architecture. Now, moving on to our next Hermen Hulst interview, this one with the French journalist Julien Chez, and this one was actually on YouTube, so pretty lengthy conversation, about 25 minutes long, and we'll just do more of a bullet point list on some of the more interesting things that he said. So first, we got a concrete breakdown of PC releases and when they're expected on PlayStation. So he said that nowadays, or moving forward, PC releases will come 1 year after the PlayStation release, with the exception of live service games where they'll likely be day and date. Now, considering this particular conversation is on video, it's fascinating to see Hermen really drive this point home. He says here again, to be very clear, live service titles are an expansion and they will always continue making single-player games. But to also give a breakdown on the live service stuff, he does say half of it is off console, so PC and mobile titles, more or less PS4 and PS5 by 2025, should be seeing at least 6 games, not the full 12 that Sony has been mentioning that they want to launch by, again, 2025. Hermen also gave a really interesting take on acquisition. We've heard before that Sony has said they're not in an arms race, and Hermen says that here again, but he also reiterates that they're looking for close partners that would fit well with them, and how sometimes they support studios from the ground up and acquire, like with Haven. He even says that with how they do it, they're not taking studios off the market. That's how he phrased it, which is certainly interesting given that, well, we've seen in the past 3 years with how many merger and acquisition activity there's been, Sony does it one way, and then other competitors do it another way. So that was interesting to hear him say it like that. Moving on to our latest update for the Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard, Brazil has approved the merger with 0 restrictions, making them the second or almost third. We're not sure about one that Bobby Kotick, I believe, was referring to before, but technically the second confirmed merger, approval of the merger, which Saudi Arabia was first, but they approved it with 0 restrictions. And if you remember, this was where Sony was kind of having a back and forth between, well, it was Sony, Microsoft, speaking with the Administrative Council of Economic Defense, and that's where Sony gave some unsurprising answers about how this is, bad for them. But overall, they did agree that this is something where they're not, the council is not meant to defend Sony's bottom line, but the interest of consumers. So a lot was mentioned in the published document about the reasoning behind approving the merger, but we will go over these points where they say, and I quote here, "It is important to highlight that the central objective of CADE's activities is the protection of competition as a means of promoting the well-being of Brazilian consumers and not the defense of the particular interests of specific competitors. In this sense, although it is recognized that part of the users of PlayStation consoles from Sony could decide to migrate to Xbox in the event that Activision Blizzard games, and especially Call of Duty, become exclusive to the Microsoft ecosystem, SG CADE does not believe that such a possibility represents in itself a risk to competition in the console market as a whole." Now, outside of this, a few things happened recently. A report came out from Deal Reporter and Seeking Alpha that stated Jim Ryan personally flew to Brussels to speak with European regulators, and Microsoft also set up a page specifically for the acquisition, which explains the purpose of it and why it's a win for everyone and why it promotes healthy competition. And on that page, it's meant to be for more public statements, more or less, for regulators, because that's what regulators do, is they look at press releases, they look at websites and what's been said publicly during interviews and things like that. So the more Microsoft puts out there that their intention is to get these IP and these games into more hands, not less hands, that's why this website was created, and that's why I still think the final approval will, the final merger will happen in totality. But they do still have, many other jurisdictions to get approval from. So the U.S., Europe, China, that's still going to be some big markets there, and there's always the possibility that it doesn't go through, but I expect that it will for the reasons that Brazil has outlined. Microsoft just has far too much leverage in making their case, and as we've also discussed, I get that Jim Ryan's getting so much heat for how he's approaching this, but again, what do you expect him to do? He's certainly not going to just he's not going to sit there and do nothing. This is a major third-party publisher, and if if the company's being asked about how this might affect the business, they're going to give unsavory answers. The only reason why Sony's even involved is because the whole acquisition is so big to where it got to that point, right? So it's not like Sony's going to throw a fit when they pick up Compulsion Games or Double Fine or an Exile Entertainment, right? Microsoft can pick up a studio here or there, but when it comes to major publishers and Sony's going to be reached out to from regulators, that's where they can, attempt to do something. But yeah, I still expect the deal will close June 2023. We'll keep following all the progress on this one. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very simple. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the news stories that I wanted to talk about you all from this past week, and our Tuesday video was, like I mentioned earlier, looking at that PS5 Horizon Remaster rumor, also the leaked documents, so if you missed that, go check it out. And then coming up, actually this weekend, I think I have an upload for you on Sunday alongside the normal one on Tuesday, so assuming nothing crazy happens, that is what we're looking at there, but otherwise, that's it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.